Welcome to this podcast from the Medical Journal of Australia. My name is Sally Block, the MJA's news and online editor. The MJA acknowledges the traditional owners and custodians of the land on which we live and work across Australia. This podcast was recorded on the lands of the Wangal people. I pay my respects to their elders past and present. This week, the MJA has published a supplement called Cure Asthma. It's a collaboration between keen Australian stakeholders and coordinated by the University of Melbourne and Asthma Australia. As the name states, the goal is not just to treat asthma, but to find a cure. To discuss this, I am joined by Professor Gary Anderson, who is a pharmacologist and immunologist and Director of the Lung Health Research Centre at the University of Melbourne. First of all, tell us, how did Cure Asthma come about and who was involved?
So Cure Asthma came about in an unusual way. I've been very interested in art and science for a long time, and I was invited to give a lecture or a talk on creative visualization for the CRE for severe asthma run out of Newcastle, a really wonderful organisation. But being a little bit of a cheeky lad, I did give that presentation and said, we need to start visualizing something really big here. We need to start visualizing a cure for asthma. Our colleagues from Asthma Australia were there. They seized on that and said, talk is cheap. Let's make this a real project. So that's how it started.
Culturally, why do you think asthma isn't seen as a curable disease?
Sally, this is really a very unusual thing. Within the same discipline of respiratory medicine, colleagues will immediately think we're looking for cures for lung cancer, we're looking for cures for cystic fibrosis, we're looking for cures for interstitial pulmonary fibrosis. But when you come to asthma, asthma's incurable. And I think it's because when I talk to people and reflect on it, we have an enormous burden of asthma. Colleagues at clinical practice struggle just to bring best available care to people now. And so I think because of this huge burden, it goes into that's a really tough thing. But when you ask consumers, what do you want? Do you want to optimize current treatment or would you prefer a cure? Resoundingly, people want cures.
And how much of a burden is asthma for the economy and for its sufferers?
So asthma extols an enormous burden in Australia. If you can imagine, 11% of the entire population are directly affected by asthma. When you extend that to family members and social networks, it's bigger. The cost runs into billions of dollars per year. The pharmaceutical cost alone is one of the largest components of the cost of the PBS, and asthma is the most common chronic disease of children. And I think this again just reflects that it's almost become ambient as a huge problem that we tend to think, what are we going to, let's just muddle forward. We have to change things. We want to get rid of that burden.
So how do you plan to go about that?
So this is really interesting. Again, when I was talking to a very senior colleague with deep experience, they said very knowingly, I think it'll be easier to cure cancer than asthma, but only because so much resource has been given to the molecular mechanisms of cancer. And because of that, we've seen enormous progress. Even if we reflect about the biologicals, the injectable medicines that have been developed for asthma that have really transformed severe asthma care, where about a third of patients can now get what's called on-treatment remission, they came through focused research in the 80s and 90s. So we're calling for, first of all, the vision, first of all, providing the evidence, and then doing the work to show that asthma is curable. So what it means is going back to look for what I call the snakes in the grass. We can get on-treatment remission. We can get really good care for many people with asthma, but we can't get cures. And the reason for that is so-called molecular switches have been turned on that cause persistence in the immune system, in the cells lining the lung, for example, that cause those cells to be in a permanently affected state, so that viruses cause effects that are too strong and cause too much pathology, and so that the process becomes chronic. We can squash that down with modern drugs, take the drugs away, and they come back. And because they come back, interestingly enough, we can now use contemporary techniques to find those switches. And that's why our program is to look for those molecular switches that keep asthma persistent and then find the means to turn them off in a very simple articulation.
So, how will you go about that? Will you be looking at the existing research, creating your own new research? What will you be looking at?
Yeah, so we don't have a cure in the hand now, so how do we go forward? One very important thing is that we've recently received funding from the federal government to take Australia's 11 best cohorts. So people probably don't know that Australia is amongst the best in the world. I would say it's the best in the world for cohort studies in clinical care of asthma. Over decades, in fact, over 6 decades, people have been studied in cohorts. All of that information is available, including samples from them, so biosamples. So we've received funding to bring all of that together into one curated collection that is put into machine learnable format. So we can use the most advanced machine learning technologies, and so that we can go back to those biosamples and use what's called multi-omics. So this is an integrated set of molecular inquiries of different technologies to find the clues to where the snakes in the grass are. And once you find the signatures of the molecular signatures, you can go backwards in molecular pathways to find the actual upstream control mechanisms. So we have that already funded. We also have world's best clinical trials. So colleagues in Australia are now treating patients to induce what's called on-treatment remission. Just understanding why that happens, but also why it's not permanent, we can do in the context of clinical trials. We also have funded and underway trials that are looking to try and prevent this terrible problem where people had asthma in early life, and then in later life, their lung function is deteriorating very sharply. So again, we can piggyback new methods onto those studies using the samples from them. But of course, that will require funding and integration of resources, which is why we've brought together the Cure Asthma Network to bring our best scientists, our best epidemiologists, our best clinicians together for integration of technologies towards these particular opportunities.
Tell us a bit about that Cure Asthma network.
So this is extremely exciting. After the cheeky comment, we went forward and brought together really some of the world's best clinicians in adult and pediatric asthma medicine, our best epidemiologists, consumers, Indigenous advice, cultural safety advisors, and also some of our brightest young scientists to go through and look at the epidemiological evidence of all the things that could be done. Where in an Australian context do we have the right clinical networks and the right evidence base to say, let's intervene here? So, for example, in early childhood virus infections that cause wheeze that becomes persistent, that becomes asthma. We know that happens. We know the risk factors, but we don't know the exact molecular control mechanisms. So we're building off that. For example, we know that early life asthma does give you deteriorating lung function. The people in the TASCO, or 10,000 patients studied for 60 years, if you can believe that. Very granular detail on those. So we're building on those opportunities and now bringing molecular science to those frameworks, and building a field of possibilities for our best researchers to use contemporary techniques to find the control mechanisms.
And you said you are looking at creating a resource with all of this information. How will that work and how will it serve the finding of a cure?
Absolutely. So what we've called the Cure ADEA project, this is the asthma data integration research engine. This will bring all of the information together from 11 cohorts, 75,000 patients. There will be a public interface so that anyone can see what's going on, and so that researchers can make a formal request to access the data or to initiate research projects. Obviously, there'll be a scientific committee looking at that, and we'll look to funding mechanisms, but very much around bringing people together on a national basis to build national resources for integrated effort, because these big problems require big teams of people.
I believe you said that Australia has led the way for asthma treatment, and therefore should we be the first to find the cure?
We want to be the first to find a cure. So if you look to the rest of the world, the world's in the same situation. We've had a huge focus on improving severe asthma. We've really neglected the opportunity of looking for fundamental control mechanisms in mild and moderate asthma, and that's where the biggest chance for cures are. Earlier disease, before extensive damage to the lung, where things are still plastic, where processes can be reversed or modified. So we're calling for a revitalized effort there. And because we have the networks of clinical experts, epidemiologists, and fantastic science in Australia, we are very well poised to do this. No one else can integrate 6 decades of data for 75,000 patients, an absolutely unique international resource. I think that gives us the edge. The other thing is that our Australian researchers, because of their international standing, are connected to the international network. So, of course, this would be a cooperative effort. We'll be doing our work in Australia. We want Australian inventions, but findings have to be replicated in other cohorts internationally. And the more we share information, the more we'll bring net benefit to people.
And so how long are you talking? How long is it going to take?
Yeah. So, when I was naive and in my 20s, I thought at that time, because I was working on the science that led to the biologics, that we might have cures within 7 to 10 years. And so experienced teachers and looking at other diseases, this is a decades-long program, but we think we'll identify the key mechanisms within the first decade, entirely new mechanisms that are regulatory, that once been the snakes in the grass that we want to eliminate. Turning those into medicines is a slow process. The world record for making a new drug from a new mechanism is 6 years, and the median is about 16 or 17 years. So the knowledge acquisition and then the translation into drugs is a long cycle. That's why we're bringing, the most important part of Curadia is to create the field of possibilities for our young scientists to inquire and carry this mission forward. So we're looking to a process where discovery in the first decade and translation from the middle of the first decade going forward.
And with AI evolving so quickly and changing so quickly and becoming more efficient so quickly, is that a hope that could help you with your research?
Absolutely. We're having a very heavy AI integration. So we're using a technology called digital twins on the cohort data to stratify risk and also the biomarkers that say what does success look like. But we're also using digital technologies, AI drug discovery and drug making technologies. So what is extraordinary, if you have a new target, there are literally methods available now when you can start to make hundreds of millions of theoretical shapes, drug shapes that fit into a space of a drug target, and then look at the preferred binding of those. And when you have candidates, make them synthetically, automatically, and test them in robotic systems. So I think we'll see globally a massive acceleration in the creation of new molecules. So I think the front end of discovery to candidate molecules will be compressed. And then, of course, there's the clinical trial phase. So let's consider that a successful drug would be like this. It would be person at risk or having early asthma. They would be treated. So we'd either have a predict and prevent molecule that said, okay, you're at high risk, we're going to prevent you getting primary asthma, or you're having the early signs of asthma, for example, in children. We're going to reverse. So we would have a reverse and restore type medicine, 2 categories. The clinical benefit would be apparent quite quickly, but the field will only accept that a remission that has turned into a cure is a true thing if it endures for at least 3 years after the treatment intervention. And that would be an off-treatment remission. So the minimum time would be 3 years, I think, to demonstrate after the intervention that someone has been put into a cured state. But what I would say is that we're also working with the best clinicians who are formalizing the meaning of remission clinically and all the parameters that would be internationally accepted as the evidence of clinical remission that can segue into enduring cures.
Well, that's very exciting, especially for parents of children who suffer from asthma.
Oh, absolutely. I was in that situation. Luckily, my children didn't ever develop asthma, but genetically and epidemiologically, they were in a very high risk category. And I just remember being so worried when they would get a chest infection and start wheezing that would persist into lifelong asthma. Now, for many people, the reality is that their children do develop early asthma, and the best that can be offered are medicines that deal with the symptomatology, the reliever and preventer combinations, but we also know they're not disease modifying and they're not curative. So that can be a lifetime of treatment. And we want to change that. We want to make it that the usual encounter with care will be a permanent cure. So that requires fresh thinking, accepting the possibility scientifically that asthma is curable. And of course, it is curable because we know from science many people who did have asthma go into true spontaneous remission. So it is reversible. And it's an acquired condition. You didn't have it, and then you do have it. So because it's an acquired condition, we can understand the molecular language of why and find the interventions that will make cures the usual encounter with the care system.
So, what's your understanding of the cause of asthma?
Yeah, so the risks for asthma are really well understood, particularly in Australian context, and it's an aggregate of risks. So a very typical cluster would be someone who has allergy or atopy at a young age, very, very common, who's exposed to poor air quality, who may have had insults during development in utero that's given them smaller lungs or changed the development of lungs, and then so often has a viral infection. So viruses in children are extremely common. I think we've all, if we're parents, we've all had kids with virus infections. I remember all of my kids having these and worrying every time about them. And the usual outcome for most people is not to get asthma after those. The usual thing is the lung heals itself, comes back to baseline, and is ready for the next infection. And we don't want to turn off virus infections. We just want to bring the response back to the normal range and type, so that you just don't tip into consolidated asthma. But it's the aggregate of those risks. Now, those risks alone are still not adequate to say for an individual person presenting to a clinic, you will definitely get asthma. And that's why we need to do the additional research so we can have really much better risk stratification. And that risk stratification will then identify people to go into the future trials of predict and prevent or reverse and restore type medicines.
For something that's so common, why has it taken until now to throw these kinds of resources at finding a cure?
I think when I talk to colleagues, there is so much good work done in Australia. It's such a burden. So many people are involved in care. And the struggle is actually to get people to use their medicines as prescribed, to use what we have now. So the mindset has been very much, this is a huge problem and we have to help people now. We can't change that. We have to do even better at that. Australia does well, we still have to do better because we won't have these cures for a while. But I think because of that, it's led to a certain nihilism, and a fixed view that, wow, this is just an ongoing problem. But the opportunities, the science says, no, this is fundamentally a curable condition. We have the technologies and the way of probing into the control mechanisms to find the next generation of molecules, just as we did earlier to find the pathways for the biological mechanisms that have now led to the injectable monoclonals. It's exactly the same process, but just with a higher ambition and looking for different things.
Is there anything else you'd like to add?
Well, I would just like to thank the Medical Journal of Australia for their work with us in partnership to produce the Cure Asthma Initiative supplement. When we put the proposition forward, there was, is asthma curable? Is this viable? Absolutely wonderful to have the ideas for this peer-reviewed to such a high standard and produced the editorial process and technical process exemplary. So we're very grateful for the journal for really putting these propositions through rigorous peer review. I would say really rigorous peer review, helping us to articulate our arguments much more effectively through the editorial process and for the conduit to the community that cares about these things. So thank you very much for your help in the journal. We greatly appreciate that.
Thank you to my special guest, Professor Gary Anderson. You can find more podcasts on our website at mja.com.au or wherever you find your podcasts. Thank you so much for listening.